Good evening, citizens. My name is Major General Nathaniel Green. I've been asked by my friend, Samuel Langston, who is a friend of Samuel Adams, whom you may know. He's asked me to come here today to speak to you about the ratification of the proposed Constitution. I would like to read you a few words with your permission. The following passage comes to us from Pastor William Temple of Brunswick, Georgia, who led the Patriot Enactors at the head of 1,700,000 patriots who marched on Washington, D.C. last year on 9/12. At the Constitutional Convention of 1787, James Madison proposed the plan to divide the government into the three branches that we have today. He based his model on a passage of the Bible, Isaiah 33:22. For the Lord is our judge, the judiciary. The Lord is our lawgiver, the legislative. And the Lord is our king, the executive. He will save us. Wisdom is the gift of God. And social happiness depends on the providential government. Therefore, we may with good reason affirm that God hath been given us our government, that he hath taught us good statutes and judgments, tending to make us great and respected in the view of the world. Only one more thing remains to complete his favor toward us, which he, the establishment of the general government, has happily formed as our particular constitutions for the perfect union of these states. Without this, all that we glory in is lost. But if this should be effective, we may say with the greatest joy, God hath done great things for us. The general form of such a constitution hath already been drawn up and presented to the people by a convention of the wisest and most celebrated patriots in the land. 8 of the states have approved and accepted it with full testimonies of joy, and if it passes the scrutiny of the whole and recommends itself to be universally adopted, we shall have abundant reason to offer elevated thanksgivings to the supreme ruler of the universe for a government completed under his direction. Now our part is to make a wise improvement on what God grants us, and not neglect or despise our distinguishing privileges, for the best constitution, badly managed, will soon fall and be changed into anarchy or tyranny. Without constant care of your families, you will have bad servants, and your estates will be wasted. So we must pay constant attention to the great family, if we desire to be a free and happy people. The power of all our republics is acknowledged to originate in the people. It is delegated by them to every magistrate and officer, and to the people all in authority are accountable. If they deviate from their duty and abuse their power, they will be taken to task. Even the man who may be advanced to the chief command of the United States, according to the proposed Constitution, whose office resembles that of a king of other nations, which has always been thought so sacred that they have had no conception of bringing a king before the bar of justice, even he depends on the choice of the people for the temporary and limited power he enjoys. And he will be liable for impeachment, trial, and disgrace for any gross misconduct. On the people, therefore, of these United States, it depends upon whether wise men or fools, good or bad men, shall govern them, whether they shall have righteous laws, a faithful administration of government, and permanent good order, peace, and liberty, or on the contrary, feel insupportable burdens, and see all their affairs come to ruin and confusion. Therefore I will now lift up my voice and cry aloud to the people, rise, rise to fame among all nations as a wise and understanding people. Political life and death are set before you. If you pursue it, your prosperity is sure, but if not, distress and ruin will overtake you. Preserve your government with the utmost attention and solicitude, for it is a remarkable gift of heaven. From year to year, be careful in your choice of representatives. From all the higher powers of government, fix your eyes upon men of good understanding and known honesty, men of knowledge, improved by experience, men who fear God and hate covetousness, men who love truth and righteousness and sincerely wish the public welfare. Beware of such as are cunning rather than wise, who prefer their own interest to everything, whose judgment is partial, who are fickle, and whom you would not willingly trust your own private interests. When meetings are called for the choice of your rulers, do not carelessly neglect them or give your votes with indifference, just as any party may persuade or a sordid treat tempt you. But act with serious deliberation and judgment, as in the most important matter. And let the faithful of the land serve you. Let not men openly irreligious and immoral become your legislators, for how can you expect good laws to be made by men who have no fear of God, and who boldly trample on the authority of his commands? And will not the example of their impiety and immorality defeat the efficacy of the best laws which can be made in favor of religion and virtue? If the body of the legislature are corrupt, you will soon have bad men for counselors, corrupt judges, unqualified judges, and officers in every department who will dishonor their stations, the consequences of which will be murmurs and complaints all across the land. Let a superior character point out the man who is to be your head. For much depends on his inspection and care of public affairs, and the influence of his judgment, advice, and conduct, although his power is circumscribed. In this choice, therefore, be always on your guard against parties and the methods taken to any interest for unworthy men. And let distinguished merit always determine your vote. And when all places of government are filled with the best men you can find, behave yourselves as good subjects. Obey the laws. Cheerfully submit to such taxation as the necessities of the public shall call for. Give tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor, as the gospel commands. I call upon you to support schools in all your towns, that the rising generation may not grow up in ignorance. Grudge not any expense proportionate to your abilities. It is a debt you owe to your children, and that God to whom they belong, a necessary evidence of your regard for their present and future happiness, and to your concern to transmit the blessings you enjoy to future generations. The human mind without early and continual cultivation grows wild and savage. Knowledge must be instilled as its capacities gradually enlarge, or it cannot expand and extend its sphere of activity. Without instruction, men can have no knowledge of what comes from their own observation and experience, and it will be a long time before they can be acquainted even with things most necessary for the support and comfort of the present life. Leave your children untaught to read, write, cipher. Teach them no trade or husbandry. Let them grow up wholly without care, and they will be fit more for a savage than civil life. And whatever inheritance you may think to leave them will be of no advantage. But on the contrary, train them up in the fear of God, in an acquaintance with His Word, and all such useful knowledge as your abilities will allow, and they will soon know how to provide for themselves. Perhaps may take care of their aged parents and fill the various stations in life with honor and advantage. Look around and see the growing youth. They are to succeed in your stead. Government and religion must be continued by them, for among these will shortly rise up our own legislators, judges, ministers of the gospel, and officers of every rank. Can you think of this and not promote schools, academies, and privileges, colleges? Can you leave the youth uninstructed in anything which may prepare them to act their part well in the world? Will you suffer ignorance to spread its hard gloom over the land? And ignorant people will easily receive idolatry for their religion, and must bow their necks to the tyrant's yoke, because they are incapable of using rational liberty. Will you then consign over your poverty to foolish and abominable superstitions instead of religion, and to be the slaves of despotism, when a happy proportion of the produce of your labors will make them wise, free, and happy? Will you hear me patiently a little further while I say one more thing of very great importance that I dare not suppress? I call upon you to preserve the knowledge of God in the land, and attend to your revelation written to us from heaven. If you neglect or renounce that religion taught and commanded in the Holy Scriptures, think no more of freedom, peace, and happiness. The judgment of heaven will pursue you. Religion is not a vain thing for you because it is your life. It has given you glory and defense in New England and beyond from the infancy of the settlements. Let it also be your glory and protection. God himself has delivered to us with equal evidence of his authority, and even superior to that given to Israel, and which he has strictly commanded us to receive and observe. The Holy Scriptures are given as the only rule of faith, worship, and obedience. And if we are to be guided by this perfect rule, we shall keep the way of truth and righteousness and obtain the heavenly glory. We are now no more at liberty to draw up schemes of religion for ourselves according to our own deceitful reasonings and vain imaginings, or to comply with the traditions and commands of men, or fall in with the refinements of human wisdom and the fashionable sentiments of the world than Israel was, to substitute modes of serving God different from what he had expressly required. We must believe that the Son of God, who made the worlds and was sent by the Father with a proclamation of mercy to mankind, has declared to us, he died to redeem men from the servitude of sin and reconcile them to God. The captain of our salvation conducts us to heaven. Therefore, we must hearken to his words. The Christian religion is refined to no more particular nation, sect, or denomination, but is designated to call all men to repentance and newness of life, to encourage their hope in the mercy of God through the only mediator, Jesus Christ, persuade them to the most cheerful, persevering obedience, and comfort them under all the labors and sorrows of the world, and the natural dread of earth, and the assurance of glorious immortality. Regard not men who are continually crying up their own sect, and employing their utmost zeal and art to proselytize men to their party. They aim to strengthen themselves by your numbers and pursues more than save their souls. Beware of receiving new opinions, which militate with the plain and obvious meaning of the word of Christ. However, they may pretend to be clearer discoveries of the truth and more comfortable and beneficial to mankind, but adhere to the written word, taken in the most natural sense, without forced allegations, whimsical constructions, or torturing criticisms. Especially hold fast to those doctrines which meet your eye in almost every page of the New Testament. Read and meditate on the Word of God day and night. While I thus exhort you on religion, it must be understood as equally an exhortation to every branch of morality, for without this all religion is in vain. That excellent sentence of a wise king ought forever to be in our minds. Industry, frugality, and the like virtues must prevail. Public crimes against person or property must be restrained and punished, or a people cannot be happy. Therefore, let all maintain vicissitude of conduct and practice everything virtuous and praiseworthy among their neighbors. My subject has led me at long last to address the people. Like frugal householders, you will save all unnecessary expenses and take good care of the treasury. Lay no grievous burdens on the people beyond their abilities, but take the earliest, easiest, and most righteous methods to reduce and pay off the public debt, unhappily involved in all the perplexities occasioned by boundless emissions of depreciating paper notes. And may I propose it worthy of your consideration, whether some reformation may not be necessary as to the processes of our courts of justice, whether appeals from court to court are not allowed beyond reason and equity, in the plainest cases or of too trivial nature, by which some of our courts are made mere vehicles, justice is delayed. The law is made unnecessarily expensive, tedious, and vexatious. I beg leave to say one more word on religion. Civil authority hath no right to establish religion. The people ought to choose their own ministers and their own denomination, as our laws now permit. Will you permit me now to pray in behalf of the people and all the departments of government may be filled with the wisest and best men, that the administration of justice may be in the hands of judges and justices well qualified for their offices, who will not take bribes or in any manner pervert judgment. In a word, that the Constitution established may in every respect be well supported by your care, and that the people may know the blessings of good government by the union of your counsels and wisdom of your proceedings.
Good evening. apologize. General Greene, ironically, I just came back from Boston, and I was supposed to be here last night, and I got stuck in Boston last night, so my whole day has been in a bit of a tailspin. I just was afraid I wasn't going to make it at all tonight, so I apologize for being late and everybody kind of being stuck. But by the way, entered as a private, right? Militia private, made it all the way up. Only, I forget, I think I've heard David say, I've never looked this up, that only 13 made it to Major General. In the context of John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg making it, but I'm sure that was another one of the 13 was Greene, so one of the most trusted. Great name. Problem is an E on the end. Other than that, it's a good name. So, all right, we're going to jump back in, but I do want to do a quick review of where we've been, just so we kind of know where to jump off into our rapid-fire walk through the Constitution tonight, and we're going to see how far we can get. I don't expect to get it all done tonight, so having timed this out, we'll reserve whatever's left for September 2nd and jump in then. But we've already talked about the fact that we're building the entire course on this great John Jay quote, where he actually told us what it would take to preserve our republic. And he said, every member of the state ought diligently, that's all of us, every member, ought diligently to read and study, and that's what we're doing in this course, the Constitution, and teach the rising generation to be free. By knowing their rights, interesting that almost that exact same phrase was in the sermon that you just shared with us. By knowing their rights, they will sooner perceive when they're violated and be the better prepared to defend and assert them. So we're still working on the knowing their rights part. We've all pretty well perceived that there's definitely some violations of our rights. And then in our last class on the 2nd, we'll talk more about how to defend and assert them. We've already talked about the wonderful things happening in the country, the resurgence, the energy, the interest that's happening out there. So many people wanting to know where we came from and what we've been about. In the first week, we talked about the fact that you can't study the Constitution without going back to the Declaration. We talked about the founding principles found there in the Declaration of Independence. We went through those one by one, talked about keeping God in the equation, talked about moral absolutes and how that slab, that foundation, was what the house was built upon. We talked about consent of the governed, and that really being the reason that we were learning about the Constitution, so that we could give or refuse that consent in a constitutional way. And then, of course, pursuit of happiness, that's our free enterprise system. We also talked about the fact that you cannot study the Constitution without cracking open the heads of the guys that gave it to us. You got to know what their philosophy was. If you want to know original intent, you got to go back to those guys and figure out what their foundation was. What was their worldview? So we went through a lot of those guys, talked about their biblical worldview. We also talked about the fact that you can trace clause after clause of the Constitution directly to the Bible, and specifically that Republican form of government we were just talking about. They got that directly out of Exodus 18:21, and we are in fact losing that. Most people think we're a democracy instead of a republic. We need to get that terminology right before we can even get the principles right. And then we talked about what our call to action would be to live out these freedoms and to pass the torch to the next generation. Then we, in the second week, decided to jump ahead to Article 3 and talk about the judiciary, because that really lays the foundation for where we think of things as being unconstitutional or constitutional. We talked about 4 myths of the judiciary. I wasn't going to show that. I was going to make you guys tell me. So an easy one right there. What's the first myth we talked about?
All branches are equal.
That they're not, in fact, all equal, right? Why not? Which branch is actually the dominant branch according to the Federalist Papers and what the founders said?
Legislative.
Legislative branch. Boy, this is a good class, man. I wish we were having a test tonight. No, it's 100. Legislative, absolutely. And which did they say of the 3 would be the weakest, or should be the weakest? Judiciary. And the warning from Jefferson that if we ever allowed the judiciary to have the final say on every law in America, we would be ruled by the despotism of an oligarchy. So that myth has cost us dearly. That's exactly where we are today. What was another one of the 4 myths that we talked about? I'm not going to let you cheat this time. Who remembers one of those? That's been a whole month, so that's why I want to do this quick review. Josh?
I think you talked about judicial review.
I did, absolutely. I think it was number 3, though. Let's see if I had to skip number 2 here. Oh, yeah, that was what I said. I gave you another. Gimme. This one was an easy one, too, because we learned and we actually pulled out our pocket constitutions. We looked at Article 3, and what does it say they serve for?
Good behavior.
Good behavior. General Greene gets it right. Exactly right. Good behavior, not lifetime appointments. And we also talked about the fact that impeachment's talked about 6 times in the Constitution. In fact, we used to do that with our judges. If we just impeach a couple of them every now and then, the rest of them, I'm sure, would stay in line. So Josh hit on this one, though, that only judges are capable of determining constitutionality, and their primary responsibility is judicial review. So we went through the quotes of the Founding Fathers. We went through the Judiciary Act of 1801 and all those things to prove that it's not just the courts that can determine constitutionality. The legislature is just as capable of doing that. We also studied the history of judicial review the not so wonderful history of judicial review. And then the fourth myth was the fact that the whole purpose of the judiciary, the primary responsibility, was to protect the minority from the majority. We went through the history of that and talked about the fact that the Bill of Rights actually applies to all of us. Then we went ahead and covered the First Amendment. We talked about separation of church and state. We talked about the Establishment Clause, the Free Exercise Clause, and how the Free Exercise Clause is the one being trampled upon today. We also talked about the Second Amendment, the fact that it is an individual right. It was, I guess we were actually about 3 days after the McDonald case, so it was perfect timing for the last class, and talked about how important that case was. And Justice Thomas's his concurring opinion, which I actually saw, I think it was Michael Barone had a great article where he was saying the same thing I was saying a month ago, which is Thomas got it right. He really laid out and charted a new course, and hopefully the court's going to go that direction and stop using the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment and start using the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And then we closed the last session with the wonderful phrase and philosophy from John Quincy Adams that we must adopt if we want to influence our culture and have peace. What was that phrase?
Duty is ours, results are God's.
Looky there. Nailed it. That's exactly right. Duty is ours, results are God's. So let's keep that in mind as we study the Constitution. When you get frustrated about where some of these things have gone and how some of the sections of the Constitution are being either ignored or abused, have peace in knowing our duty is what we're responsible for, and that's what we're here doing, and I think we're doing a much better job as Americans in exercising that duty. We're going to find out in November if there's enough of us, but we're certainly doing a better job of fulfilling our duty, and we'll see what the results are that God has in store for us. I just want to say a couple of things about the approach we're going to take tonight. Really throughout this whole course, I should have started with this at the very beginning. I don't want anybody to think that this is intended to be an exhaustive study of the Constitution. There is no way we can do that in 4 sessions or even 6. And the more I've prepared, Dean, the more I think you were right. We should have done 6. It's going to be hard to cram this into 4. But at any rate, don't think that we're expected to cover everything in detail. We have a very limited amount of time. So remember what our purpose is. We want to know our rights. We're doing the John Jay quote. We want to know what our rights are. So we're not going to be able to study every case, every result, every argument on every side of every part of the Constitution. And I wish we could spend more time on trivia, but when we get into things like presidential succession and how many times the 25th Amendment has been invoked and all that kind of stuff, we're just not going to spend any time on it. We might have some fun and throw out a few of those things, but we just don't have time to do a lot of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take every section of the Constitution as amended. One of the hard things about the Constitution is trying to flip back and forth, especially when it comes to Article 2 and the presidency. It is so hard to follow all those amendments because when you take the presidency, you got the 12th, the 20th, the 22nd, the 23rd. All of those are influencing and changing Article 2. And so what we're going to do is look at each of these articles as amended instead of trying to look at the original language and then go look at the amendment and say, okay, this part is struck, and you know how you look, often you look at the drafts and it's, or not the drafts, but the Constitution, you have underlined portions are changed by the amendment, but you're not sure how they're changed or whether or not it's just a word or does it strike the whole thing. It gets very, very, very confusing. So I've got a gift for you tonight that is going to make that much, much easier. So we'll take all the sections as amended. We will not spend much time on judicial interpretation. I'll throw a few cases out now and then, but this is not like a constitutional law class in college. We're going to spend our time on what the original intent was and what the document actually says. And it's sort of like counterfeit money. If the folks at the bank do not study counterfeit dollars. They study the real deal. And as long as they know what the real deal feels like and looks like, they'll recognize the counterfeit. So what we're going to do is study the real deal, and then you can decide when those judges come out with those crazy opinions whether you agree with them or not. Last thing is we're going to study some plain language for some of, I don't want to do it on all of the sections because there's some sections that I think we need to read the actual language of the Constitution, but then there's some, like Article 2, when we get into succession of the President and that sort of thing, that we're going to study some plain language. Don't think that I'm saying that should substitute. I'm a big originalist. I think you got to know what the original words were, what they stand for, what they meant back then, what they meant to the founders. That's why we use the 1828 Webster's Dictionary to look at words and try to figure out what the meaning is. But when we give you plain language tonight and 2 weeks from now, that plain language, that's what we've done. We've gone back to the 1828 dictionary. It's been very carefully looked at before we give you this version of the plain language. So first thing I would like to do is give you a gift, and that is what a friend of mine has done, which I think he did an outstanding job. I was going to do something similar to this, and I'm so glad he did it because he did it probably better than I would have done it, and it saved me the time and the energy. this booklet that we're about to pass out. Would you guys help me by passing these out? And this was not part of the deal. Y'all get this free of charge at $12 value. Well, wait, there's more. I'm pretty sure I have enough. Let's go ahead and. Don't be sticking extras in your back pocket, though. You bring me back the ones if we have more than what we need. This little booklet is called The Constitution Made Easy. And what Mike did with this thing, my caller, and by the way, the website is theconstitutionmadeeasy.com. I highly recommend you go to his website, order 50 of these or 100 of these, and give these out when you give out a pocket constitution. It doesn't really replace a pocket constitution because it won't fit in your pocket, but it is an incredible study guide for the Constitution. And here's what he did, and let's use as an example, since we've been talking about it, Article 2. And if you turn, let's see, to page 16, no, it's 18. If you turn to page 18, okay, and you'll notice on the left-hand side of the book, as you have it opened up, will always be the actual language of the Constitution. On the right-hand side is the plain language. Now, this guy did a great job of going back and very carefully, meticulously doing the plain language. Most of the time, or not most of the time, a lot of the times he just uses the actual language. But when it's something that's a word we don't use today in our vernacular, or it's used very different today in our vernacular, he's changed that and made it easy for us to read it. And the best part is that he's taken the amendments and incorporated them in the blue that you'll see on the right. So when you read on the right, you're reading what the Constitution says and is today after the 27 amendments. So take, for instance, this Article 2 when we get into the president and how the president's elected and how the electors meet and all of those things. All of those amendments that we were talking about earlier, the 12th, the 20th, the 22nd, all those things influence how the president is elected. So if you turn over to page 20 and 21, you'll see that there's huge sections of the actual Constitution that have either been dramatically changed or completely removed. What Mike does on the right is he just keeps going instead of you having to flip back and forth. When you read through Article 2 on the right there in the blue, you're reading it as amended, so you don't have to flip back and forth. And you'll notice on the left, often there are times where there's big blanks where he's just taking that out. But in order for you to flip the page and still be at the same place in the actual Constitution and the plain language Constitution, he'll often have places that are skipped there. So we're going to use this tool in some of the areas, like Article 2 for sure, to help us get through very quickly. I think you could sit down and I think he says 30 minutes. I think easily 30 minutes, an hour for just about anybody, and read the Constitution in the plain language on the right without having, try to compare and just say, I just want to know what my government looks like. How is it really supposed to work? Where do these clauses come from? Somebody can sit down and read the blue part of this thing very quickly, very easily, and it begins to put it all in place. So as we do that, please don't think I'm suggesting that we change the Constitution to have the plain language or that you should only study the plain language. We're doing that for ease so that we can get the 30,000-foot view of what the Constitution says and where we can find those clauses that are so under controversy today and actually go back and look at them. We're not going to spend much time tonight on the areas that aren't controversial or aren't really up for debate today. We'll fly through them, talk about them very quickly. We'll try and spend our time on the things that are actually controversial because I like that. It's more fun that way. Okay, so let's just start actually before even the stuff that's really going to matter with the preamble itself. My 9-year-old daughter was supposed to be here with me tonight to recite that for you guys, and she does such a great job doing that. But she informed me that she was having a sleepover with her cousin Lily tonight, and I got outvoted. So she is not here. So I'm wondering if anybody knows it by heart and can jump up. Josh, jump up and recite it for us. Come on up front, man. Get on TV. This is going to be broadcast on 227 stations around the country. Not really. Give Josh a hand. Me too. Hey, just kind of wiggle your ear if you forget, and I'll put the slide up.
We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
Excellent, excellent. All right. And did not know that that we were going to do that to him. So very, very good, and that actually speaks very highly of your parents. So Bruce, nice job, buddy. All right, so that's our preamble. Doesn't actually authorize Congress to do anything or any other area of our federal government. It just sort of was setting it up. In fact, Gouverneur Morris was the chairman of the committee that gave us the Constitution, actually put the wording in place, and it was almost a last-minute afterthought that he ended up putting that in there to kind of set the stage and say, here's what we believe we're leaving this convention with the goal of doing. If we can make this our Constitution, this is what we'll look like. I just want to point it to, actually, one other thing. They didn't say a perfect union. They said a more perfect union. In other words, they knew the Articles of Confederation had problems. They knew that we had things we had to improve on. They didn't believe we would ever be perfect. They knew that government is difficult and all those things. But they did say it would be more perfect. But the two things I want to point out, oops, I don't have the slide. Where'd my slide go? I guess I didn't move it over there. Okay, well then I'll use my laser pointer. Two things I want to point to. Promote the general welfare, because we hear that all the time. In fact, you got congressmen and even the president right now quoting that clause, and the one other place in the Constitution is mentioned in Article 1, Section 8. They're claiming that that is what authorizes them to do health care and all these different things. And so again, if we want to know what the original intent was, we've got to go back and say, well, wait a minute. What did these guys understand the general welfare to be? What does general welfare mean in 1787? What would you guess that it means in 1787? Somebody help me out.
The well-being of the states.
Say again?
The well-being of the states.
That's exactly right. It's the well-being of the states. The idea was, and you can even go back to the Articles of Confederation for similar language, the idea was we need a federal government to make sure that all the states, that their general welfare, in other words, they're not, in fact, let me read the Webster's definition because I think it fits perfectly. Let's see. I had it on a slide and I don't have it now, so we'll just all cheat. Flip back to, let's see, it's going to be page 66. Footnote 25. Okay, so Webster's 1828 dictionary defines welfare as exemption from any unusual evil or calamity, the enjoyment of peace and prosperity, or the ordinary blessings of society and civil government applied to the states. It was for the states to have mutual and general welfare. For the defense and welfare of the United States was the phrase they used in the Articles of Confederation. So the idea is we need the federal government just to make sure that the frame is in place. Not that we're going to go individually to you and make sure that you personally have welfare or that you have all of those things in that safety net, but the idea is that the system will allow for each and every one of us to have that opportunity. Very different concept than what's being pushed in Washington, D.C. today. They would say that promoting the general welfare means socialism, that we want to make everybody equal, that we want to make sure everybody has that general welfare in terms of in the way that welfare is used today in that term. That is not at all what they meant. Second thing I just want to point to, because people always say godless constitution, secure the blessings of liberty. Where do you think they got that concept from if these were all godless men? Blessings of liberty will not fit in any other worldview. In fact, Gouverneur Morris, we mentioned, is the guy that wrote this preamble, and he's the one that we also talked about 2 months ago, if you remember, that told us that religion and education are to work side by side. That he said if you don't have religion in your education, you're missing the boat. He understood the importance of making sure we acknowledge God in everything that we do. Securing the blessings of liberty was just another acknowledgement of God. Okay, let's look at just the overview real quick. I want to pass out a sheet. This just helps me. This is the way that I memorize things or study things. I just always need a quick, I guess you could even call it a cheat sheet, if you will, that I can get a quick glance to try to put things in a particular place. And yes, I know everything's kind of like crooked when you look at this. That's the way I memorize things. I need to see them in different places on the page. So I'm just kind of passing all that on to you guys, whether you like it or not. You get it that way. But let's just quickly look at overview the articles, the amendments, and then the Bill of Rights, because it'll help us when we're talking about a particular area of it to put it in place. First, just the articles themselves. Article 1 is where we get our congressional authority, so we'll break that down in a few minutes in terms of the House and Senate and the different powers. Article 2 is the executive, for us the president, and also is where the vice president gets authority. Article 3, the court, which we already covered, the judiciary. Article 4 talks about things the states can and can't do. Article 5 is the amendment process, which we're saving for the last session. We're actually going to talk about some of the proposed amendments that are out there. Article 6 talks about the debts that they had incurred up to that point, and the supremacy clause, that the Constitution is the final law of the land. And then Article 7 is ratification, how that will take place in the signature. So that just kind of gives you a 30,000-foot view of the articles themselves. The amendments, in the same way, let's just fly through them, and I group them together based on what they're amending. In other words, instead of trying to memorize them in order, let's think about them in terms of what they do. Bill of Rights, we'll skip for a minute. Everybody's pretty familiar with that, but we'll spend some more in-depth time later tonight. All 5 of these amendments affect the presidency. The 12th, the 20th, 22nd, 23rd, and the 25th. So they affect the presidency in some way, and we'll see that whenever we read through Article 2 as amended. The 11th Amendment is for the judiciary. It's very specific and actually was a response to one particular case, and it just simply means the original Constitution, the 11th Amendment, in Article 3, says that if you're going to have a suit from an individual against a state in which they do not live, that the federal judiciary will have jurisdiction over that. There was a case that went to the Supreme Court that scared the dickens out of all the states because they were concerned, now we're going to have people outside of our state suing us, and it's going to go to the federal government, and we as a state government are going to have no say over it. So they quickly had this amendment, and now it says that the federal courts do not have original jurisdiction on suits against states from someone outside of their state. And actually there's been some decisions saying that even when you're suing your own state, that they don't have original jurisdiction as well. So we're not even going to spend any more time on that one unless y'all want to know more about it. We can do that in question and answer period. Then there are 3 that specifically affect Congress. The 17th Amendment obviously changing our senators to being elected directly by the people. Probably a big move away from republicanism and more towards democracy, and one could certainly argue was not a good idea simply because it took away that buffer from kind of the fad voting of Congress, just putting their finger in the air and going with a poll, rather than having the will and the power and the ability to do what was right regardless of what it was going to cost politically, because you had the buffer of the states being the ones sending them there, and therefore what they would do what was right for the states, not just for what, in the words of the founding fathers of mobocracy, would want to do. So 17th is where we changed it to senators being elected. They were originally sent by the legislatures. The 20th is all about when the terms begin. That wasn't defined originally, and so the 20th defines that both for Congress and for the President. And then the 27th is all about money. That's the one that simply says that Congress gives themselves a pay raise. It doesn't go into effect until they have stood for election. So if they pass a pay raise right now, they can't take the extra money, can't get the extra money until after they stand for election in November. If they're reelected, then the new Congress will be the ones that get that pay raise. Ironically, or interestingly, I will give you some trivia on this one. The 27th Amendment was one of the original 12 proposed, and it sat dormant for 200, I forget the exact number of years, until a young guy right here in Austin, Texas, by the name of Greg Watson, who works at the Capitol to this day, and used to work in the office next to my office when I was a state rep, discovered it and said, I think we can get this thing passed. And so he went on a mission, and he managed to push hard in the different states to get the remainder of the 2/3 that were needed, and ended up pushing the whole thing through. So it was just one guy really that was the motivating force behind that. But now, and it's the last amendment that we've had in our Constitution. But that happened. Greg Watson, right here in Austin, Texas. In fact, we can Google him tonight when you get online, and it'll tell you the whole story of him doing that. So those 3 are all about affecting Congress. Then we have 3 amendments that were really all sort of lumped together in terms of time. They weren't right back to back, but they all dealt with the same issue really. 13th, ending slavery. The 14th, really civil rights, and we'll spend more time on the 14th because it's more than that. And then 15th was voting rights, and you couldn't be denied that because you had been a slave. And that actually is duplicated in the next category, which is all about voting. 15th, you can't be discriminated against in terms of voting based on race. The 19th Amendment on gender, which we call women's suffrage, but I'm pretty sure what it really was, it really passed so that men would no longer suffer. Because they were being told, you vote for this or else. And anyway, okay, 24th Amendment, bad joke. 24th Amendment is, again, about money, no poll tax, so you shouldn't be kept from voting because you're not wealthy. So the 24th Amendment keeps them from having a poll tax, and then the 26th Amendment is lowering the age to 18, and actually is worded to say, no, you can't keep somebody from voting based on age as long as they're at least 18. So those 5 are all about voting. Here's everybody's favorite amendment, probably the worst thing we ever did in the history of America, the 16th Amendment when we adopted an income tax. Let me just tell you up front, we are not going to spend any time on was it ratified correctly, can we get it overturned, should we not comply with it, and all that. Okay, you're at the wrong class if that's what you want to do. It's done, it's there, we got 97 years of precedent. If you want to change it, which I'd love to change it, we need a constitutional amendment to change it. We're not going for any of the red herrings that are out there right now. I'm not going to waste our time on that. So we won't spend any more time on the 16th Amendment in the course either. It is what it is. I don't like it. I'd love to have, if we have to have a flat tax, but I prefer consumption tax personally. But there it is, 16th Amendment. Okay, and then...
Not till we get rid of the 16th
Yeah.
Amendment.
Right?
None
Not
of
till
those
we
other
get rid of
options.
it.
Until we get
That's
rid of
right, because we don't want both. In fact, Obama's been talking about wanting a consumption tax and an income tax. That's not what I meant. Thank you very much for clarifying that for me. Okay, and the last ones that we won't spend any time on, to drink or not to drink. The 18th, of course, the abolition of alcohol, and then the 21st, reversing that one. No point in spending time on those because that's not the law of the land today. Oh, there's my other slides where I was going to so neatly have the rest of the preamble disappear so that we could see just that phrase. And then we would see it from Webster's 18. Look at this. I worked so hard on these slides and I haven't had a place. And then we would see secure the blessings of liberty. Okay, so much for that. All right, let's dive right in. Article 1, and if we open up our little handy-dandy, the Constitution Made Easy booklet, we're going to be looking at Article 1 as amended by the 14th, the 16th, the 17th, and the 20th Amendment. So when we read these sections, we're going to be reading them as amended. And we're going to go, first of all, just look at what each section does. Again, just like we kind of got a 30,000-foot view and looked at all 7 articles, now let's dive in on Article 1 and let's overview the different sections. Some of these we won't come back to because they're so simple and not much there. Others we'll come back to and spend a little bit more time. Section 1 simply saying they have the authority to make law. This is where we empower Congress. Okay, so all lawmaking powers go to Congress. Section 2 is for the House of Representatives. We'll come back and spend more time on that one in just a moment. Section 3 is about the Senate. We'll spend more time on that as well. Section 4 is about dates for elections and how long their terms are going to be and where they're going to meet. And we can actually look at that very quickly if you want, but it's not, again, anything controversial, so it's not real fun. They did not used to have that defined the way that they do here, and they can change. This could be changed again if we don't like it. But bottom line is, their terms end on January 3rd, and the new term begins on January 3rd. So they're about 2.5 weeks ahead of the president. Section 5 is about their own rules. It gets into some minutia here, but if y'all want to run over it, we can. They actually are the arbiters of their own elections. So if you have a contest of a congressional race, it goes to Congress. They decide whether or not the incumbent or the challenger wins or loses, which I never have really liked that. I don't like the idea of leaving it up to the good old boys that are in the club to decide whether that member of their club is going to end up winning when it's a close election and it's been contested. But that is what it is. That's the way we do it. Okay, they make their own rules for how they attend. They make their own rules for the proceedings, for what disorderly conduct is. Section 152 on page 11, 10 for the original. You can have a member actually dispel on concurrence of 2/3. If we could just get 2/3 to throw out a whole third of them. Right? No, that's not where we need to go with this.
I'd say that would be a good start.
It might not be the third we want. That's the danger there. So, I mean, it might not be the third that we want thrown out that gets thrown out. Okay, it talks also about what a quorum is, that they have to keep a journal. That's a great clause that they put in there in the first place. That's a way for us to keep up with what they're doing. Of course, they can exempt stuff out if they believe that it requires secrecy, and I would want them to do that on a lot of national security issues instead of handing it over to the New York Times. Section 6 is about compensation. That part, the fact they can't be arrested. Now, this has been interpreted by the courts to not mean a criminal arrest. It's typically civil type issues. They're not going to prevent a member of Congress from being, in fact, we saw, who was it? It was a Kennedy, I know, but I can't remember. Patrick Kennedy, arrested at one point. That was during session, and he was still arrested. You can't hold another office as a member of Congress. So that's all from Section 6. So, I just didn't feel like some of these areas were areas y'all really wanted to spend a lot of time on, but you just wanted to get an idea of where they were. And so, again, you can go back and read through word for word if you like in either the original Constitution on the left or the Constitution Made Easy on the right. Section 7, now we all know this, that any appropriations bill has to start in the House. We hear that all the time. We all watch it on Schoolhouse Rocks, where there you can actually see where it is. It's Article 1, Section 7, Paragraph 1. All bills for raising revenues shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments as on other bills. We've all heard it since we were kids. It's maybe the first time you've ever actually seen it there in the Constitution. That's where it is. All right, presidential veto, that takes up several clauses here, and you know, if you want to get into how long, I love the fact that Sundays accepted is in the Constitution several times. Here it is with regard to veto as well. That's on page 12. That'd be paragraph 4 of Article 1, Section 7. I did find one interesting thing that might be considered trivia. That because I never thought about this. I never actually asked myself this question or heard anybody talk about it. But as I was studying the last part of the presidential vetoes, paragraph 5 there, 175, every order, resolution, or vote to which the concurrence of the Senate and House of Representatives may be necessary, except adjournment, shall be presented to the President of the United States. I got to thinking about that. Well, now wait a minute. An amendment already requires 2/3 to come through the House and the Senate. So it's already veto-proof. So does the President have to sign that or be given the opportunity to sign it? And could he veto it? It wouldn't do any good because it'd go right back to him and they would repass it. But it says every order resolution has to go to him. And I was wondering about that as I was studying this. And then as I got to the 11th Amendment and was studying it a little bit more, it turns out the 11th Amendment was actually challenged on that very grounds, that the President did not sign the amendment. And the court said, his signature is totally irrelevant. The President has no role when it comes to amending the Constitution. He means nothing. So you only got to work on one end of Pennsylvania Avenue. So the court says anyway that he doesn't have to, but when I read the plain language, it looks to me like he does. But at any rate, even if it's a ceremonial thing, now what you typically have or have had with the last 4 or 5 amendments, other than 27, is you had presidents have a ceremonial type bill as Johnson did. But okay, so that's Article 7. Article 8 is one we will definitely spend more time on. That's the do's of Congress, what they can do. And then Article 9 is the don'ts for Congress. We'll come back to both of those. Article 10 is some don'ts for the states. So let's go back in and start digging in a little bit deeper. That's the overview. So very quickly, just for review, you got Section 1, lawmaking authority. Section 2, the House. Section 3, the Senate. Section 4, days and terms and meetings. Section 5, miscellaneous rules like quorum. Section 6 is compensation and no arrest and cannot hold another office. Section 7, appropriations start in the House. Talks about the presidential veto. Section 8, what they can do. 9, what they can't. And 10, what the states can't do. So let's back up and go to Section 2, which is where we learn all about the House of Representatives and what they are empowered to do. So Article 1, Section 2 begins on page 4 of your Constitution Made Easy and page 5 for the plain language. First of all, we know they have 2-year terms. Why do you think the founders did that?
Let people get back to work.
Say again?
To let the people get back to work, the representatives get back to work.
And they didn't expect them to be there all the time either. In fact, we're gonna see the plain language is that they were to meet at least once a year. In fact, I skipped over that. I was gonna dive into that. At least once a year. Now that meant, you know, they didn't want to be there. They didn't want to be in Washington, D.C. all the time. So the Constitution had to say, hey guys, you got to come in at least once a year for a little while just to make sure there's not anything that just absolutely has to be done. Now we can't get them out of Washington, D.C. They had to make them come home just in August because it's right before the election. So the mindset was very different back then. But the other reason for 2-year terms is for us to make sure that we have a quick accountability opportunity. That instead of sending them there for 6 like we do the senators or for an extended period of time, every 2 years, those members that are supposed to be the closest to the people have to come home and run for re-election. Election standard is the same as the state legislature. What that does in the Constitution, it says that they have to be elected in the same way that we elect our largest body of our state legislature. So whatever our rules are for how that election will take place for the state legislature in Texas, members of Congress have to have those same rules as well. 25 years old, citizen 7 years, and a resident of the state. So that's your minimum requirements for a member of the House. And then Section 3, we based our, and this is again incorporating all the amendments. If we go back to the original language, you're dealing with slavery and the 3/5 compromise, and you got all these other complications. Bottom line is today, the number of representatives that we have is based entirely on population. It cannot be more than 1 for every 30,000. We're not anywhere close to that. I think now it's up to 650 50,000 or 700,000. It's way up there. Good news for Texas, we should get several more after the enumeration. I refuse to call it a census. That's the enumeration.
And that's regardless of citizenship too, right? No.
Say that again now?
Always.
It's just population, regardless of citizenship or not.
Well, it's supposed to be citizens.
It doesn't say citizen though. It would be nice if it did.
Yeah, well, okay, let's amend it then.
Yeah.
All right, the enumeration, which we just mentioned, is here in section 4. This is the one place that the Census Bureau gets its actual constitutional authority for being able to ask us really only one constitutionally valid question, which is, what?
How many people live in your house?
How many people live in your house? That's it. That's what the Constitution allows for, and that's why I love the fact that that section 4, paragraph 4 actually uses the word enumeration. Now, unfortunately, the word census is used in 2 other places in the Constitution, but it certainly meant enumeration for them. I encourage you to go to that website right there, censusfacts.info. I think they do a great one-page summary on what what the federal government's actually authorized to do. It also lays out for you. You know what the fine is this year if you don't answer all the questions about your toilets and whether you have trouble bathing and all the things? I mean, really, they ask some very, very personal questions. You know what the fine is? Higher. $5 grand.
What?
$5 grand. You know what it was in the last census?
250.
$100. They jumped it to $5 grand to intimidate you and to intimidate me. Fortunately, you had people like Congressman Ron Paul, Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, and others like that went on television nationally and said, this is wrong, they should not be doing it. No one has been prosecuted under it, no one has been fined, and you had a lot of people helping all of us to know what we had to do, what we could do if we wanted to, what the risk would be if we said, I'm only going to answer it. For people that say, well, yeah, but they're not really going to bother you about it and all that, listen, I have been hounded, I'm talking hounded by the census, because I was one of those 1 out of 50 that was picked to get the long questionnaire last time around. They camped outside our property. We have a gated entry because we have a little family compound there with 50 caliber guns. I'm not really. Take that off the table. We don't have 50 caliber guns. We do, but you can't see them. Anyway, the family compound has a gate, and I mean they would camp outside my gate and wait for anybody to open the gate, and then they would come through and camp at my house. It was just ridiculous. It made me so angry because of the way they did the deal. I mean, we have no problem. We gladly volunteer. How many people live in our house? And that's not a problem for me. But I really do think it's an invasion of privacy. Now the court has ruled it's not quote an invasion of privacy, so you can't win on those grounds right now. But I do think you would have very strong grounds that they don't have the authority to ask those questions or to force you to answer all the questions that they ask now. Yeah, Josh.
Did you eventually answer all the questions, or did you win?
No, I did not eventually answer all the questions. And they were back this time for another round. I don't think I was the 1 out of 50, and it may not have been me that they were going after. We never answered the door
So you just answer the one, how many people in your household, and then you leave everything else blank?
Yes.
That's what we do now, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the reason I was on the list is because one time they did a survey on what kind of work you do and income and all this kind of stuff, and it was a they had segmented out. I don't know why we pay our taxes so that they can do all this. Well, I do too, because that's how you get to socialism. Government needs to know everything about everybody, and they say it so we can provide better services for you, because we're from the government, we're here to help. But anyway, it was an entrepreneur deal. It was self-employed businessman. That's what it was. And so I answered it like a 10, 12 question deal, and man, that got me, I guess, on the hotline, because from then on they bug us like crazy. But anyway, so all of that to say, constitutionally, when somebody says, but yeah, aren't they supposed to ask all those questions? There's your clause. Go right to that clause right there. All it says is enumeration. That's what they're supposed to be able to do, is count you. And census, and I thought I don't have the definition for you, but if you go to that website, censusfacts.info, it has that 1828 Webster's Dictionary definition of what a census is, and it is an enumeration. That's it. It's not all the other information that they go for. Okay, so paragraph 5 is how we deal with vacancies in the House of Representatives. 6, that they can choose their own speaker, that they have the power of impeachment. So section 7 on the Senate, you get 2 from each state. They have 6-year terms. That's in paragraph 1. We have staggered terms. We don't want all 100 senators being up every election. Well, it would be nice maybe if they only had 2-year terms, but since there's 6, you got to stagger them. So instead of having to wait 6 years, we mix the states. So it's 33, 33, and 34 on the staggered terms. How we deal with vacancies, whether or not the governor can appoint. Okay, wait, if anybody saw that. So how old you got to be a senator? Josh?
30.
Not 25 yet? Who said 30? You get a cookie. I don't have any cookies. Okay, 30 years old. The congressman had to be how long a citizen? 7 years. Senator has to be how long a citizen?
9 years.
9 years. You're cheating. You're looking at your constitution. That is not cheating, by the way. That's what it's for. So I'm very proud of you looking at your constitution. That's how easy it is, folks. You just look it up right there in the constitution. And then how long a resident of their state? Doesn't say. You just have to be a resident of the state. Okay, so 30 years for them, citizen, 9 years, resident of the state. Paragraph 5 is about the vice president. And I thought this was interesting, presiding over the Senate. Our vice presidents don't do that very often at all. Yes, you know they can't cast a vote unless it's to break a tie, not to make a tie either. I used to think they could actually make a tie, but they can't. They can only break a tie. But when you go back and you look at the definition of preside, they're really supposed to be there running the Senate. You know, that'd be nice if we actually did that, and you give it a little bit more checks and balances, because you'd have the executive branch there having a little say-so over how the operations went. Okay, they get to choose their own officers. They have the power to try impeachments. And we all kind of remember this from, by the way, today we need to all have just a stop for a moment of silence. It's President Clinton's birthday. Okay, that was fun. All right, so speaking of President Clinton, the Senate has the power to try the impeachment. So you might remember how this worked. The House actually impeaches. So they decide, is there something that's rises to the level of impeachment, and if they decide yes, that doesn't mean the person's guilty. It's sort of like an indictment by a grand jury. The House is the one that does that. It goes over to the Senate, and then the Senate actually tries the impeachment, and then the Constitution says that if it's the president that's being impeached, that the Chief Justice will preside. So that's exactly what happened in Clinton's impeachment trial, where he was not convicted. Had he been convicted, let's look here, and somebody tell me right out of the Constitution what could have happened to him had he been convicted. So we're in Article 1, Section 3.
Disqualified from holding office.
There we go. Disqualified from holding office. And what else?
Disqualified from holding any official position.
So they can't give him any other punishment. So if the President of the United States commits murder, and there's an impeachment hearing for that, and then he's convicted in the Senate of that impeachment for that murder, is that the worst that can happen to him? They may what? Say that again?
He or she may still have a life.
That's exactly right. So now it's up to the local authorities to do their job as well. So it doesn't mean we're not like the aristocracies and the kings and all that, where you had that protection of that office. We can kick them out through impeachment, but then they're still going to stand trial. And that's actually what happened to Clinton. Even though he was acquitted of, that's right, he still had the civil trial, but he also was reprimanded by the bar in Arkansas and lost his license, so he couldn't practice law anymore.
Okay, for 5 years.
Well, 5 years, but still, at least he got some punishment. That's a good thing. Okay, oops, I went too far. All right, so now let's go through Section 8. This is where we all tend to think, okay, Congress has too much power, but let's look.
Section 8 doesn't
If only we could make a bill. Section 8. All right. So let's just run through some of these. Here we get the General Welfare Clause again. That's in paragraph 1. Again, means the same thing. It doesn't change, even though Charlie Rangel and some of the others seem to think that it does. It still means the same thing. And if you go through all these, there's a couple things I want to point out. The Commerce Clause, the third clause there, or paragraph there, is what has been so abused by the Congress. They have driven a Mack truck through this clause. Now, when you read that, somebody read it out loud for me.
Regulate trade with foreign nations and among the separate states and with the Indian tribes.
Okay, read the original on the left-hand side.
To regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes.
So just common reading of that, what do you think that means in terms of with the states?
Make it regular, regulate it.
But does it mean, okay,
Commerce is different than trade.
what kind of trade do they have the right to regulate, according to what those words actually mean?
This,
What kind of commerce? What type of transactions? Who do the parties have to be for them to be able to regulate it?
Foreign nation states or Indian tribes?
Indian.
Foreign nations or among the states, meaning between different states. So it could be an individual in one state and an individual in another state. That would still be commerce that I believe they could regulate even based on that language. But what they've done with the Commerce Clause is they've now allowed themselves to come into a state and regulate you even if your product is never sold out of state, is never sold to anyone that's selling it out of state. In fact, the case that's the holding authority on this actually was a guy growing his own agriculture and not even selling it. But because they said his growth of his own agriculture and consuming it could actually impact whether or not the price went up or down at the local store because he wasn't buying or selling, and then the ripple effect. So now we're going to regulate everybody based on this concept of commerce, totally different from what the Founding Fathers intended. They did not want the federal government getting into our business in every area like they do now, because that's what the state authority was for, if and when it was appropriate. General Green.
Yes, Mr. Green, would you...
With no E on the end.
With no E on the end. Would you please explain to the good citizens the difference now between what Obamacare does with the Commerce Clause versus what we just discussed, regulating of commerce?
Well, they're using the Commerce Clause and they're saying we're going to actually be able to come in. I mean, are you talking about in terms of forcing an individual to buy?
Yeah, in terms of someone who's not even engaged in commerce and compelling.
Yeah.
Interest.
So now you got the guy that was growing his corn and consuming it, no longer growing any corn, no longer consuming any corn, hates corn, doesn't want any corn, has nothing to do with it, and now the federal government is going to come in and say, we have the right to regulate your commerce and your eating of corn, and we're going to make you eat that corn.
Yes.
So open up. Here it comes. That's exactly, is that what you mean?
Yes.
I mean, that's literally what they're doing. Through that clause.
They actually have a law that says that we can't, I mean, if you go to the breadth of it, it actually means we can't have garage sales and we can't give away gifts and
It's total government control. I mean, that's what that was the reason for this document, was to prevent that from happening. And now they're using this document to make it happen.
If I may make one more point.
Hey, you're armed, General. You can make all the points you want. What you don't know is that we're in Texas. Everybody else in here is armed.
Thank God for the Second Amendment.
That's right.
Is the flip side of this is if Obamacare is upheld in the Supreme Court and the government is ruled to be allowed to compel you to engage in commerce and force you to buy a product, then it is no stretch at all for the Supreme Court then to allow them to prohibit you from buying a product.
That's right. No salt.
Absolutely.
which is what they did.
That's what they're opening the door
They
for.
did with before, 90 years ago.
And there is an appropriate way to stop it, and we're going to talk about that in the next class.
There is,
Okay, I was afraid I was thinking I missed something there. Okay, so anyway, we could spend a month on the Commerce Clause, and we did in law school, right? At least that long. We can't do that here. So, you know, the bottom line is it's being used in a way totally different than what the founders intended. All right, so you got your immigration is done by Congress, coining money is done by Congress, post office, all of that is in here. Skip over to paragraph 8, Article 1, Section 8, paragraph 8. Somebody read the original constitutional language of that one for me.
To promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries.
So if you stop after the comma and you just say, Congress has the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts, then you can justify the billions of dollars that we spend on those sorts of things coming from Congress. That's not what the Constitution says, is it? Because you got to go after the comma. And what's it say after the comma? What's the appropriate constitutional way to promote the progress of science and useful arts? Exactly right. Patent and copyright and patent. Protect the free market. Give the free market an opportunity. Give people an opportunity to protect their invention, to protect their creations, but then make them go out into the free market and actually earn their living, as opposed to what we do today with so many people that we fund in terms of, and we use the term science and arts, but we're not doing it the way that the Founding Fathers intended it for it to be. Okay, the next clause is actually what we talked about last when we talked in Article 3, how Congress has the authority to reduce our federal judiciary, as Congressman Steve King said, to nothing more than Chief Justice John Roberts sitting at a card table with a candle. Meaning we could get rid of all the other courts. You could do what Thomas Jefferson did when he came in 1801, fire half the judiciary. That's perfectly legal, perfectly constitutional. They have the authority to do it. Well, he didn't just fire him, it took a congressional act, but through that congressional act he did it. So, to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court, or the plain language, to create courts underneath the Supreme Court. That is in Congress's power. They should actually think about revisiting the number of courts and the numbers on the courts once in a while, and it would make those guys a little more nervous and a little more accountable. Piracy and felonies. To declare war, here's an interesting one. I'm going to step on some toes on this one. Is there any language there on declaring war as to how the piece of paper or the vote, or whether it's a vote or a resolution or any of those things, is any of that defined there in the Constitution? It's not. So when a lot of my friends were ranting and raving about how Congress never declared war, President Bush was going off on his own, war on terror, blah, 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 they did declare war. They declared it through the resolution that they passed, and they declared it through their actions. By over and over and over again funding the war, they were declaring war. So the Constitution doesn't say they've got to pass this specific piece of paper and say, we are declaring war against X, Y, and Z. Their actions can declare war as well. And that's exactly what they did in the War on Terror. So I do disagree with some of my more libertarian friends, including Congressman Paul, on this one, that the president was out of line in prosecuting the war without Congress ever declaring it.
I ran across an interesting aspect of that argument, that one of the officials denied that they were declaring war, because if they had declared war then they would have invoked some treaty obligations. So it sounds like they want their cake and eat it too.
Well, and one member could be against it and say, I'm not declaring war because of X, Y, and Z. But I mean, they got out on they publicly stood, they gave their speeches, they passed the resolution, and then every time they spent money for the war, they were declaring war. So I don't know what treaty he was talking about, or she. I don't know who it was that.
Yeah, it was one of the executive branch officials.
Well, the executive branch can't declare war. So that part, you'd be right on.
Well, that's the other problem I have with it, because the resolution, I thought the resolution said we're giving the president the power to decide whether or not.
Oh, I think Congress can give the president, absolutely give the president the power to act or not act, and what those actions would be. And actually, as Commander-in-Chief, I think that's the only appropriate way to do it constitutionally. I think that's the problem with the court handing down decisions on how they can do it and trying to micromanage the war. I think once they say this is a cause worthy of action, then he's absolutely got authority to continue until they either rein him in with the purse strings, which is the quickest way to do it, just don't fund it, or they pass a resolution and say, you know, this war is over, you no longer have authority to go down this road. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. Okay, raise and support armies, no appropriation of money to be used. You know, they didn't, a lot of the founders very much against having standing armies. That's one of those appropriations bills for the military had to keep coming around. The world has changed, obviously, and I think the founders regretted that. When it came to the Barbary Powers Wars, George Washington definitely regretted it. He wished that he had the ability, had a navy, that he could go in and stop the radical Islamic terrorism that was taking place starting in 1784. It lasted for 32 years, and he could do nothing about it because he didn't have a navy. He was spending 16% of the federal budget in his last year in office paying ransom to these radical Islamic terrorists that were capturing our sailors on the high seas and ransoming them back to us. Adams actually was spending 19% of the federal budget paying for ransoms. That's how far that thing was affecting us. And when you go back to the philosophy behind what those four states were doing, they believed that they had a spiritual reward if they attacked the infidel or killed the infidel. And Jefferson had negotiated with one of their ambassadors, I believe it was 1787, it was about 3 years into the war. He'd been one of our guys to go over and negotiate, and he really began to understand what he was up against. That's why when, I forget his first name, I think it's maybe Keith Ellison, Congressman Ellison from Minnesota, the Muslim that was elected about 4 years ago, when he was sworn in, the big picture that went around with everybody, he and Nancy Pelosi smiling real big with his hand on Thomas Jefferson's Koran. Everybody made a big deal about Jefferson having a Koran. And he even made it sound like Jefferson might have been a Muslim. And I mean, we were getting all kinds of calls on this thing. And we were doing our radio program, and actually, David began to answer those questions. And he said, well, Rick, you got to understand why Jefferson had a Koran, you got to go back into the history, and you got to understand our first war on terror. He said, we're not in our first war on terror. And we were like, we're on the air. So, of course, I said, you know, of course not, David. Why don't you tell us about that first war on terror? I didn't have a clue what the man was talking about. It was the Barbary Powers War. If you got any Marines in the room, in your song it says to the shores of Tripoli. That's where it comes from. It was that first war. What happened was Jefferson gets elected. Now Adams it was building up the nation. He wanted to go, but he never had he felt like he didn't have the will of the people and just couldn't make it happen. And they weren't militarily ready. Jefferson gets elected. Day one, he says, no more ransom, we will not pay another penny, because he had an understanding of their mindset, that they really believed that if you got killed in a jihad, you went straight to heaven. That's one of the, you know, with Islam, you don't know if you're going to heaven, you got to weigh the good things, the bad things, you might make it, you might not. That's kind of how the deal works. But if you get killed in a jihad, guaranteed, you're going straight to heaven. And the 77 virgins and all that. In fact, y'all heard about the guy that went to heaven, and as soon as he gets there, he's an Islamic terrorist, and he's in heaven, and he's getting the tour, and George Washington walks up and just decks him. I mean, knocks him to the ground. And the minute he gets up, here comes Thomas Jefferson, kicks him as hard as he can, knocks him back on the ground. Patrick Henry just pummels him. And he finally says, what is going on? And they said, well, you knew you were going to meet 77 Virginians, didn't you? Anyway, another bad joke. You are going to edit this, right?
Gonna have to now.
All right. I don't even know what I was talking about. Oh, the first war on terror. Jefferson. So he goes in with the Marines, and it ended up actually lasted for 2 more presidents, because it was 32 years before the whole thing was over. But we got a 150-year peace dividend as a result of it. So it was a good action. Where were we? Okay, jump down to the last clause on that page, which is 17, dealing with the District of Columbia. Of course, they didn't have it named here yet because we didn't know where it was going to be and for sure, and what the title of it was going to be. Got a lot of effort right now to give the District of Columbia statehood, to give them voting rights, all those things. We've already given them the right to have electors. That's the 24th Amendment. No, 23rd. I'm missing my numbers here. 23rd Amendment. They get to now send electors to choose the president. A lot of debate over this. But when you read the Constitution, there's nothing in it that gives them the right to statehood. And in fact, obviously many of us argue that it prohibits that, because the reason they wanted that land to be ceded to the federal government is so you'd never feel like there was favoritism, you'd never feel like the federal government was doing anything special for that one state, if it had all been in Maryland or if it had all been in Virginia.
Only 10 square miles?
And
10 miles.
10 square miles, and Congress has all the authority. So in other words, they replaced any state government with Congress itself. That's why a lot of these things that are happening right now, when Obama came in and ended the school choice voucher program for those kids in D.C., I mean, that's a congressional decision. The federal government has the authority, so they don't have a state government, and they're not supposed to. The founders would have never intended for them to be a state or to have a state, and that's why they gave the authority to Congress to run the district. That's why all those things come before the committee there in Congress to run those things. So it's a bad idea. There's some people pushing for it, actually from both sides, trying to make different deals, but I hope it doesn't happen. But you'll find nothing in the Constitution that says they should be a state, and I think you find language that would say they should not be. Let's see, section 9. You know what? I think I want to skip, because I know you guys got it. We're running late. I want to skip over, instead of us going one by one on these powers. Let's at least get a cursory review. We'll save Article 2 for next month, but let's at least get a cursory view at the Bill of Rights itself, so that you can kind of place some of those things that that you often hear about, but may not know where to go to find them. So turn to page 39 in the Constitution Made Easy, and we'll just run through a quick review of where you find those freedoms. We've already covered 1 and 2. We did that last month. 5 freedoms out of number 1. Let me take it off the screen, see who can name all 5 of them for me without looking at your Constitution. 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. What are they?
Religion.
Okay?
Press,
Religion,
speech,
press, assembly, speech. One more.
Well,
Nope.
that's 2.
Okay, religion, press, assembly, speech. There you go. General Green got it. Petition for a redress of grievances, exactly. And then the Second Amendment, of course, is our right to bear arms. And that's, of course, only for the military. It's only for the militia, right?
No, we are
No.
militia.
What does it say? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, what? The right of
The people.
the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Clearly an individual right, and McDonald, the case that was just handed down, actually found that. That's a very good thing. Third Amendment we don't worry too much about, but I would say when you read the Third Amendment, it doesn't say that soldiers can never be quartered in your home. It's not what it says. That's right. Read it, and by a manner prescribed by law. Somebody read it out loud for us.
Soldiers may not be housed in private homes in peacetime unless the owner gives his consent. Soldiers may only be housed in private homes in wartime in a way that will be described by law.
So that second part doesn't say with permission, does it? It says in a manner described by law. It's never happened here. Let's pray it never does. But all right, so that's the third one. Before it searches the seizure, somebody read that one. We've all heard it a million times. All right, in the interest of time, I'll read. The people, let's not read the plain language, though. Let's read the original, because the Bill of Rights, I think we should memorize by the original language. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Very important amendment right there. We see it raised quite a bit. Okay, Fifth Amendment. We usually only think of the Fifth Amendment as our right against self-incrimination, right? You always hear, I plead the Fifth.
Right.
There's a lot in the Fifth Amendment. Somebody want to read it?
No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury.
Okay, so that's one, is your right to a grand jury. Go ahead.
Except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb.
Okay, what do we call that?
Double jeopardy.
There we go. You just won your Jeopardy points whenever that show's go. Go ahead.
Nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor to be deprived of life, liberty, or property.
And that part that she just read is what we always hear pleading the Fifth, the right against self-incrimination. This is where you find it right there. Go ahead, Darla.
Without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation.
Very good. Okay, so you had the due process clause there, and then this takings clause. This is one that we know is being ignored. The Kelo decision, I think we talked about this the first week, didn't we? The Kelo decision is the one out of Connecticut where you had the government, little local government, taking someone's property and literally selling it to a developer. The reason being they could get more tax base. So think about our church right here. This church is not giving the city any property tax, right, Brother Diggy? We don't have to, because Founding Father said you don't have to, and we kept that tradition from the beginning, and they got that out of Ezra. It's something you can trace back to the Bible, but no taxes on churches. So, well, the local government here would love to take this property and sell it to a developer. They could put a big mall in here, because then they can get hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars worth of property taxes, right? So the government has an incentive to get rid of us and put somebody else in here. So the Founding Fathers, they didn't say it could never happen, but they said it could only happen for public use. That wasn't a mall. That's what we all. What do you think of as a well, maybe a park. I would even argue against a park. A road, transportation, that sort of thing. That's what the founders were envisioning. And now we've got governments taking property simply for the idea of a greater tax base. And the Supreme Court said it's okay. The case was called Kelo. It's a terrible decision. This is what happens when you have 5 of 9 justices deciding the final, the final say on our law, and frankly unprincipled and not a biblical worldview. Because if they had a biblical worldview, they'd go back to respect for this kind of thing in private property. So it's a very, very bad decision, and I truly believe churches are the greatest at risk, and it's already happening across the country. I think it was 28 states now that, and they all did it within about a year, that passed state laws saying you can't do it. So fortunately, we in Texas did it very quickly. Frank Court from San Antonio led the charge on that as soon as the Kelo decision was handed down. We had it passed here in about 6 months. And so the states have, the states that understand this quickly put a stop to it, but that's still, there's still about half the states that are in danger of this. But the idea is that you should only be able to take it through government force, eminent domain is what we call it. You should only be able to do it if it's for public use, and you have to give just compensation, which means market value. So in those cases, as much as you may not be for a public transportation project, at the end of the day, if you're outvoted, if your representatives that elect you decide that they're going to do that, it is constitutional. And I would argue that, for instance, the Trans-Texas Corridor is constitutional. Not saying it's good, I'm saying it's constitutional. But the people spoke, let their voice be heard very loudly, and it's dead, right? But they could have done it constitutionally speaking, but it didn't happen simply because the other parts of the Constitution worked, and we were able to let our voice be heard and have our petition for a redress of grievances. We had a lot of assembly over that one too. Okay, Sixth Amendment, speedy public trial, witnesses and attorney. Who wants to read this one? It's a little shorter, I think. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. Oh,
That's right.
ladies first. You get the next one.
Okay. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his advance.
So almost all of those things we kind of take for granted. We're familiar with that. I forgot to mention back on the Fifth Amendment that some of these things that we hear in the Constitution, we assume that means we have that right in our state as well. But not all states have this same language in their constitutions. And you remember when we talked about the McDonald case a month ago, it really documented how some of these things have been upheld by the Supreme Court to say that because of the 14th Amendment, the states have to do it too. But some of them haven't. Grand jury was one of those things that was not. The U.S. Supreme Court said, nope, that only applies to the federal cases, not to state cases. If your state doesn't have a requirement for grand jury, you don't have to have one. Everybody kind of agrees that after this McDonald case, just Katie barred the door, it's going to take every freedom in the Bill of Rights, if not the entire Constitution, and be used against the states. So now the states will have to comply with all these things as well. I'm not going to argue whether that's good or bad. I like the way Thomas says it. If you do it through the Privileges and Immunities Clause, it makes sense. If you go to the 14th Amendment debates on the floor of the Senate and the House, that's what they said they were doing. But the court's been doing it through the Due Process Clause, and that part is not good. So anyway, but that's where all those things are found in the Sixth Amendment. Seventh one's a lot easier, so we'll hand it to a guy. See, the girls get to talk. And we'll hand it.
In suits of common law where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. Now,
Can't you imagine you're suing the gumball manufacturer because you lost your quarter, you don't get a trial by jury. I'm just joking. $20 is the threshold. That was a lot more money back then, of course. All right, Eighth Amendment, excessive fines and bail, cruel and unusual punishment. Who's up? Let me get somebody. Yeah.
You just said it.
Big brother. Well, I was just summarizing it for you, but you go ahead and read the actual. I like the idea of reading the Bill of Rights word for word. Just something about it. It's like, I'm not going to say sacred, Brother Dickey, but it is special.
Excessive bail shall not be required, or excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted.
So we hear that a lot, cruel and unusual. I don't think the founders would have agreed with some of the court decisions that have been handed down. It's not quite this bad, but essentially if you don't get your color television in prison, it's cruel and unusual punishment. We've pretty well gone soft. The founders would have probably said, get them out there busting some rocks. Okay, number 9, this one's for all of us that are really into the 9th and 10th Amendment. Who wants to read this one? Go ahead.
The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny, disparage others retained by the people.
Very important concept right here. Huge concept. Because the idea of enumerating rights means that if your rights are enumerated, if they're all enumerated and it's exclusive, if it's not in here, you don't have them. And so what the founders were saying with the 9th Amendment is, we're not covering everything here. We're mostly saying this is what the federal government can do and what they cannot do to you. But just because we mention it in here, or just because we don't mention it in here, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So the idea was, we may not have talked about that particular right, you may have it, and it's not specifically in here. So we, the people, our rights are not enumerated. And then in the 10th Amendment, the states' rights are not enumerated, nor the people's, but the federal government's rights are enumerated. Their powers are absolutely listed in the Constitution. That's what the 10th Amendment's all about, is saying they are limited. They are enumerated. They are listed here in the Constitution. So don't go dreaming up things that you think the federal government can do when they can't do it. But that's, of course, what we do now. So who wants to read the 10th Amendment? I bet half the room could probably recite it, but go ahead.
The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people.
There you go. So Congress is limited. It specifically says what their powers are, and they're not empowered to go outside of that. Okay, so that's a quick review of the Bill of Rights. Again, you got your cheat sheet. I did that so you can just memorize where each of those basic concepts are found, and then when you want to go back and read the actual language, you got your handy-dandy Constitution made easy. And if it sounds confusing to you, or it's a clause that was amended quite a bit, then read the blueprint on the right-hand side. So back to the overall review. We got Article 1, that's Congress. We pretty well covered that. There's probably some more out of Section 8 that we'll pick up next month. Article 2, the President, we didn't get to. I was going to try to fly through that tonight, but we'll cover that one next time. The court we've covered. The states, the amendment process, and Article 7, those are all pretty quick. We'll do all those together next month. We might be here 6 hours next. No. I'm gonna work on it, Dave. We're gonna try to get it all. We might have to go into the 5th and 6th sessions. No, I don't think so. I think we can get it in. But I really urge you to just take time between now and 2 weeks from now to read, if nothing else, the blue section, the Constitution Made Easy, the plain language. I think this is a very, very helpful tool. I've gotten to where I refer to this one quite often because it's just laid out really well. And again, I encourage you. Mike Holler's the guy's name. He's also got some really good recommended resources on the back 2 pages. I agree with him on these. Those are very good resources to if you really want to dive in even deeper. And then he's got a great chart at the very back on our federal government and how it works. So again, Mike Holler's his name. If you want to drop him an email and say, hey, thanks for the book and for what you did, because it's great work. He's, I think, done a wonderful thing here. We're going to team up on some other seminars in the future, and we're going to include a lot of that in the textbook that we're eventually going to do for this class. So we're late, I know, but if you want to try to do a couple quick questions, we can.